Good morning, Professor Cemil Aydin, and good evening, friends in India, and good evening, friends in Turkey. We are going to start a wonderful session now on book discussion, and the book which we have today is this book by Professor Cemil Aydin, The Idea of the Muslim World, a Global Intellectual History. And this is one of the most fascinating books published in recent times, which is introducing some alternative discussions on the very troubled history of late uh, colonial history in the Islamic world, and the discussions between or negotiation between the Islamic world and the West, or the negotiation between Islam and the West in general. So there are many concepts which we have been used to listen in popular literature, such as Pan-Islamism, Pan-Asianism, Khilafat, and now we are listening many more terms, especially after the rise of Islamic or Islamic extremism, and the phenomena of terrorism has also brought up these discussions to fore. So there is a greater curiosity and increasing curiosity about the history of Islamism and Pan-Islamism, and overall the political aspirations of the Islamic world and Muslim world. So on the other side, there are many Muslims as well who have interpreted their history uh, in terms of their aspirations. So there are many Muslim intellectuals who have defined and they have introduced terms such as ummah, and they have introduced this term as a very essential and a definition of an imagined unity among Muslims. Maybe this kind of unity is going to be an intellectual unity or a geographical and strategic unity, but they have worked on this kind of unity, and they have uh, even mobilized many social movements on the basis of their conceptions. So here we have come to the point when we read the book of Professor Cemil Aydin, in which he is discussing all of these discussions, and he is giving a very detailed reading of history, and he is giving a first-hand account from the text and from the happenings of this period. So in this sense, what I find that his book is not a typical history textbook. Rather, it is a book of intellectual encounters in this period. So this book offers not only a history, but also the history of ideas and history of intellectual evolution, and which is going to be very important in the making of international relations. And I understand that when we are talking about non-Western international relations, this book is going to be contributing a lot in the discourse of non-Western international relations, because this book is covering a lot of areas from non-Western perspectives. So let me just start from a paragraph from Professor's book, and in his words, I quote: "I therefore offer a critical genealogy of the idea of the Muslim world, showing how, starting in the late 19th century, pan-Islamists and Islamophobes have used the assumption, ideal, and threat of Muslim unity to advance political agendas. Together in tension, Together and in tension, they have created the Muslim world for their own strategic purposes and positioned it in everlasting conflict with the West. I hope that by recovering the imperial context in which essentialized ideas about Islam and the West developed, we will come to appreciate the historical contingency of the Muslim world, to understand more fully the role of religious identities in international affairs, and to reflect on ways in which the overlap of race and geopolitics limits struggles for rights and justice." So this is in his views. Let me give you a very brief summary of the argumentative summary of Professor Aydin's book. Uh, he's starting from uh, uh, questioning that how Muslims have imagined themselves. And then he's asking another question, how the West is imagining the Muslims. So he found fundamental problems in both imaginations. And then he identified many essentialized definitions which are used by both sides. Many Muslims, such as many Islamic intellectuals, such as Sayyid Abul Ala Maududi and Sayyid Qutb and other Islamic movements, they have introduced some ahistorical concepts of Islamic unity, such as Ummah, beyond their strategic realities. And also the Western world somehow racialized. He is using the term racialization of Muslim identity, not just Muslim identity, but also the identities of Negro and Africans and other ethnicities. So in this racialization of identities, how Muslims gradually became a part of Muslim world, and they are being imagined as a single entity or single imagined community by the West. And in the same way, Muslims also started imagining themselves as a single imagined and united community. So in these two ways, then Professor is asking several other questions. What exactly happened? So he goes into looking into the cooperation between the empires, and he argued that the empire's system was working in its own interest, and the Ottoman Empire and the British Empire and other empires, they were cooperating with each other to maintain the imperial order. And this kind of imperial order was not necessarily driven by religious interest or ideological interest. So then came the point when this imperial order and the interest which were uniting this imperial order collapsed, and the final disengagement or conflict between the British Empire and the Ottoman Empire happened. And in this way, the Ottoman officials, they started looking against the British Empire, and they started looking to the east, and they started making some solidarity with the Asian communities, including with the yellow races, which they call in their literature. So Professor Aydin is discussing in detail, and he's giving so many examples for such as what exactly why the Muslims were never a united community. So he's giving an example that for Tipu Sultan, he asked the help from the Ottoman Empire, but he could not secure the support from the Ottoman Empire. Similarly, many other conflicts in which the Ottoman Empire basically supported the imperial order and preferred the maintenance of the imperial order over the religious solidarity. Another interesting example is Napoleon's war on Egypt. So he has dealt this happening also in detail, and he has given very interesting details that how the Islamic world or the so-called Muslim world was working in close cooperation with the imperial powers to maintain that kind of order, and it was not driven by religious motivations. So in the late 20th century, this order was broken, and then the idea of pan-Islamism was evolved, an idea of pan-Turkic identity was also evolved, and similarly, other identities came to struggle against each other. So in this way, he concludes that the idea of pan-Islamism was a product of real politics rather than ideological or religious motivations. So here he is giving all kinds of these debates and arguments. So I will conclude here with this brief introduction of his main arguments in the book. And then I would like to request you, Professor, to give us, our readers and our friends who are watching you on this day of the seminar, the literary festival, uh, an introduction of your book. What made you to write this book, and what kind of ideas you were battling with in your mind when you started thinking about this book? I have read somewhere that you originally started to writing something else, but you ended up with this project. So, especially in the last chapter, you have mentioned that you started another intellectual journey, but you ended up with this fantastic book. So, I would like to know from you, sir.
Thank you, Omer, for hosting this and moderating it. And I would like to send my greetings to Aligarh Muslim University. I hope I will visit there one time. It's one of my dreams to visit there. And it's a very significant in the sense that Aligarh University is is central to the story that I'm telling in the 19th century. Both India and the Aligarh generation after Sir Sayyid um, were key actors in imagining a global order. They were crucial in not only Muslim intellectual history, but also what I would call global intellectual history. So the book has, in some ways, it's related to India, and Aligarh is trying to write a non-Eurocentric intellectual and international history of the world, while being critical of some of the terms that we use to divide the world into civilizational containers. I mean, you summarize it in some ways. The misconception that I was disturbed by is to imagine that there was already some sort of a parochial, isolated uh, Islamic political order, and then Europeans came and there was a necessary clash between the two. Um, and then from then on, there's always a clash. So when I was writing this thesis, I was very disturbed by this narrative. I also wrote this place at the same center where Samuel Huntington was the chair of that center. So I was very familiar with how they think about the kind of eternal clash between the Islamic world and the West, which is very historically inaccurate. Any Indian would know that in the 19th century, India had a very harmonious relationship with Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, and very different communities. In 1857, they revolted together. So there was a kind of, even though the Mughal emperor was chosen as the head, but this was not as simple a Muslim revolt against the West. It was Indians revolting for their rights as their liberation. So I was trying to write a history that tries to account for why this diverse imperial settings were erased and suppressed in terms of its memory, and instead we always narrate the story of Islamic world and versus the West. And in that sense, the founder of your university, Aligarh University, is very crucial in this story because he was very disturbed by how William Hunter narrated the 1857 Indian revolt. And he wrote refutations to that. According to William Hunter, Indian Muslims were not supposed to be loyal to the Queen, or every Indian should probably know this argument that he wrote, but he wrote against the reality that there wasn't much any difference between Indian Muslims and Hindus in terms of their political attitudes. I mean, they wanted their rights, they wanted their equality, but they thought that they could get that right and equality while being part of the British Empire. So Hunter was saying that no, the Muslims could never be part of the British Empire because as Muslims, they are fanatic. They wanted to create their own caliphate or a kingdom. And I think my story starts from this point onwards, how gradually, with the second generation of Aligarh, probably, that Muslims began to also first reject this argument that Islam is somehow a fanatical religion, necessarily oppose European empires, but then gradually say that that, well, it may have been a good idea if Muslims are actually united and they have solidarity, because we can defeat racism with our solidarity. And I think this Indian attempt to connect with the Ottoman Caliphate, Ottoman Empire, emerged in that context to prove that the Muslims are modern and civilized, to show that, you know, there is a Muslim kingdom with a caliph which is living in a living in a beautiful European city in full diplomatic relationship with Europe. Actually, the Indian Muslim connection with the Ottoman Caliphate was not a Muslim reaction or revolt against the West. On the contrary, is to prove that Muslims can be an equal partner of that globalizing European imperial order. So to say that I was trying to kind of be critical of the Orientalist notions of Islam and politics, to show in the first moment of the construction of Pan-Islamism, that's one of the arguments of the book, that Pan-Islamism did not exist before European colonialism. It actually emerged in that encounter. And to show that in the first moment of Pan-Islamism, imagination was still very imperial. India was crucial. India is central. I can even take that case further to say that India and the debates about the future of India is also central for the international relations theory. Since we have our distinguished professor Ramakrishnan here, I want to also, for the kind of audiences to know that many of the debates on Ummah, Islamic thought, and international relations actually about the future of India. And we forget how crucial that debate was, which is also the future of the British Empire and the future of the international order. And the Ottomans got into that debate because their goal is to go back to the golden age of Ottoman-British alliance, which is symbolized by the Crimean War, where the Britain came in support of the Ottomans against the Russians. Once that alliance is weakened through Islamophobia of Gladstone and other kind of Christian white racist Islamophobia, which is challenging the alliance, saying that the Muslim Ottomans are not worth our alliance. We should let the Russians come and defeat them. Ottomans have this strategy to say that, no, we should go back to our alliance by making the case that India will justify our alliance. And that sounds like a very strange argument, but this is how they think, is that India is composed of Muslims and Hindus, but it is the largest Muslim population area. And they have special relationship with the Ottoman Caliph, Ottoman Sultan, but it's a very spiritual relationship. It's a secular argument. And the British Queen is ruling these areas. Because we both have very special relationship with this amazing place, India, we should have a special relationship. We should be in alliance. So in some ways, India became a justification for a return to the golden age of Ottoman-British alliance through arguments for Pan-Islamism. So my early chapters of my book is talking about how Pan-Islamism was an imperial project of an Ottoman-British and Indian alliance in their mind. But I will stop here because I will say that Sayyid Rose Mesud, for example, he's very crucial in this story. I don't go into the detail, but since he was also chancellor of Aligarh University at some point in his career, he is, for example, as a second generation Aligarh intellectual, thinking about future of India, future of Indian Muslims, future of the Muslims in general, their rights in the new order, and he wants to make connection with the Ottoman Caliphate. It's symbolically very important. In fact, I am aware that in Aligarh University, the PhD gowns and even honorary PhD gowns include Ottoman-style fez. That shows, the kind of Aligarh modernism, looking up to Ottomans as a symbol of Muslim modernism. And then Sayyid Rose Mesud at some point also look at the Japan. So you could see that a pan-Islamic intellectual could also be pan-Asian, because the goal is to remake the world to make it more equal, egalitarian, and to overcome the racialized empires. And this does not necessarily to mean that the British Empire should completely end. I think initial plan was to reform the empire, But once that reform fails, then of course you want to get out of the empire. It's the second stage. So let me stop here and to see if you have any questions instead of me summarizing everything. But this is the first part of the book is talking about India-centered Pan-Islamism one. In the second, towards the end, I talk about later Cold War Pan-Islamism, which is very different. It's a Middle East centered, and there's a disconnect between the two because in the first part, India is connected to the Arab world. So Indian Ocean routes are very important. India is seen an extension of the Middle East, or Middle East is actually seen as an extension of India, Arab Middle East. In the second part, in the age of nationalism in the Cold War, India is seen part of Asia. This is after partition. So there's more of a concern about the Middle East, oil, Saudi Arabia, Iran competition, or initially Saudi Arabia, Egyptian competition. And in that context, there's a new Pan-Islamic imagination, which is very different than the early Pan-Islamic imagination.
Thank you, Professor. I would go to another question now. In your book, you are also talking about the multiplicity of Islamic governance. You are talking about that the idea of Ummah did never exist as a single unit from the day one. And even the imperial time, you have mentioned at least 30 different rules, Muslim rules were existing. And even the Ottoman Empire never aspired to become the single Islamic voice of the entire Muslim world. And you have specifically given the example of how the agreement about the Crimean Muslims allowed the Ottoman Empire to speak for the Crimean Muslims, but the Ottoman Empire abstained from speaking for the Muslims who were living inside Russia. And this shows that how the Ottoman Empire was not necessarily looking or imagining itself as the champion of all Muslims in the world. So also you have mentioned the concepts of Darul Islam and Darul Harab, and then how the Chinese Muslims were favoring the Chinese empire, and despite the fact that the Chinese empire was not neither Darul Islam nor Darul Aman, but they were supporting. So how do you would you make a comment about that multiplicity of Islamic politics, and what do you think today, being said that Muslims want a single political rule such as the ISIS?
Yes, it's a very good point, Omer, and I appreciate that because it also goes back to kind of one commonality, the kind of invisible commonality between India, Persia, Ottoman lands, the kind of northern areas of Muslims who had shared lineage of Genghis Khan and Tamerlane together, Babur Tamerlane. And this is kind of a forgotten aspects of Islamic history, partly a result of Orientalism, because it's the Orientalists who told that Muslim politics is defined by early juridical texts on caliphate. It's them who actually said, oh, I know what your politics is because I can read some bad Arabic and I can understand. This is exactly what William Hunter was doing to Sayyid Ahmed Khan. Sayyid Ahmed Khan is a very cosmopolitan figure. He knows about the Mughal Empire. He has a very complex imagination of the future where Hindus and Muslims are together. It's William Hunter who is fundamentalist, who's saying that, well, if you're a Muslim, you have to read your text, and you're not even supposed to believe that a woman could be a queen. So he's challenging that the Muslim can actually like Queen Victoria, which is not true. That a lot of Muslims had respect for Queen Victoria in some ways, including Tanavi and many other legal scholars. So we know from history that this post-Abbasid empires had an art of governance that is not reducible to Islamic tradition, but it's also not rejecting it. They're very proud Muslims, but they're also proud of their ability to rule a complex empire as in India, right? That the Hindus and Parsis are part of that empire. It's a Muslim emperor there. in also Persia and the Ottoman empires, but others can be part of that empire. That doesn't make them necessarily secular in our contemporary sense. They are still very proud Muslims, but we have to imagine, understand Muslimness as a capacious cosmopolitan category, and I think that is a very that's a kind of forgotten, erased memory that we need to revive. And I'm very familiar with how some of our colleagues who work on Aurangzeb get a reaction from some groups in India saying that he was an evil Muslim. That is not true. Aurangzeb wasn't much different from, his grandparents, Akbar or Shah Jahan or Jahangir. That because the idea that the Aurangzeb is this stereotypical Muslim fundamentalist destroying Hindu temples is a fiction. That scholars show that that's not true. That we don't have such an idea. But that fiction relies on British Orientalists who are there doing this kind of tricks in rewriting history and in a divisive way, dividing Hindus and Muslims from each other, but also arguing that Muslims were India was always Hindu, Muslims were outside forces that came in there, and the British are coming to take liberating the India, basically Indians. And I think we need to be careful about this. And unfortunately, some of the later Islamist Muslim fundamentalists kind of agree with European Orientalist lies to say that good Muslims will, of course, destroy the temples, which Muslims never did, right? Or good Muslims will always impose their religion on others. I mean, there was no imposition of one religion over others. And I think the history of different Muslim dynasties is a good example of it. So I watched the movie Padmavat on a Turkish Airlines, and I was very disturbed by the movie, and I'm very saddened that how this history is being remembered now today in India. And there are similar cases about how Ottoman history is remembered. I know that the Turkish television shows are very popular in South Asia. I want to caution people, yes, they should like Ertugrul, and it's a good movie, it's fun to watch, but they have to understand that the Ottomans were more complex. The depiction is a couple of degree more Islamic than they were, right? These people were proud Muslims, but they're also proud empire builders, and their relationship with non-Muslim communities have to be highlighted there. And the Mongols were not always evil in the eyes of the Ottomans. I mean, we need to know, if you're watching Ertugrul, the depictions of the Mongols are a little bit unfair. I mean, especially after they became Muslim in Persia, there was no categorical hatred of the Mongols. They already became Muslim, and I think we need to remember those moments. But thanks for this reminder how historical memory matters in shaping contemporary ideologies and political identities. So we need to read more history in a sophisticated way.
Yeah, thank you. That is a wonderful reference for Ertugrul, which is also kind of creating or revising the Ottoman history for a global audience. Or if I use your term, essentializing the Ottoman history,
Yeah.
maybe.
The Ottomans initially paid tribute to Mongols. Um, and then when they stopped paying it, and they were Ghazis and they were conquering places, but their relationship with Christian communities were very harmonious in some ways. There were Christians who were also supporting the Ottomans. And at some point, we were talking about the fact that Professor Omer Enes's campus is in the location of a battlefield between the forces of Tamerlane and the Ottoman Empire, where the Tamerlane's forces defeated the Ottomans. It's actually the first Ottoman Empire ended in 1402 with this defeat, and then they reinvented the empire. But I was noting that at that moment, for example, Tamerlane's claim was that you used to pay taxes and tribute to my ancestors, which is Mongols, and you keep paying them. And I think Ottomans were not doing it. So the Tamerlane reminds how important that Mongolian legacy is, and he's the one who was also saying that I can combine Islamic legacy and Genghis Khan's legacy together. And I think a lot of Muslim empires were proud of Genghis Khan, as well as Alexander the Great. So um, in that sense, I think we need to think about Ertugrul in a new light from this perspective.
Yeah, you have correctly mentioned about Ottoman-Christian relations, and from here, I would like to ask another question about, especially you have mentioned about the siege of Vienna and how it has been projected as a great trauma for the Europeans, and so great trauma that it is now instilling some kind of Islamophobia in some Nordic countries who are trying to say that by 2083 they will expel all of Muslims from Europe. In the same chapter, you are also explaining how harmonious the Ottoman and Western relations, and European relations were, and after Britain and other European empires, they had held many talks, and then many Muslim sultans from all over the world they traveled to the European countries. So in this way, I would like you to shed some light on the today's binary of Islam versus West, or Turkey versus West, or the Ottoman versus West relations.
Yeah, thank you. This is a very good reminder to show how a stereotypical Orientalist narrative of history can be very poisonous today. So your reference to Battle of Vienna is important because both Anders Breivik, who did the shootings in Norway of the youth labor camp, and racist attacker of Muslim mosque in New Zealand, refer back to Battle of Vienna, and they claim that they are taking a revenge of that, right? Europe is Christian, no Muslim should be in Europe, and then Battle of Vienna shows that Europe was under attack from Islamic world, and then Europe repelled this attack, and they need to do the same thing with the immigrants. And some Orientalists like Bernard Lewis repeat that racist mantra. He even sees, or you worked on Arabs and Muslims, he even sees the presence of Turks and Muslims in Europe as a sneaky attack within Europe to repeat the Battle of Vienna's logic and get rid of that defeat. So there you can see how racism appears in this kind of narrative. But then in reality, in Battle of Vienna, Ottomans were fighting for Hungarian Protestants. So if you're a Protestant and see Ottomans as your enemy, you're being absolutely stupid, because Ottomans were actually fighting for the Protestant Christians against the Catholic. So any Protestant, at least on that level, should be siding with the Ottomans against the Catholics. But even beyond that war, there were so many wars that Ottomans fought with Russia, were for Poland. Polish-Ottoman relations is interesting. They, in the kind of Battle of Vienna narratives, at the end, Polish army came to help the Germans, Austrians, to defeat the Ottoman army in the Battle of Vienna. But then, since then, Poland was divided, vanished for a couple of times. And during those times, Polish elites and king and intellectuals actually came to Istanbul as the refuge. So there's a Polish village in Istanbul. It's a very beautiful place. Some of the Polish aristocrats actually joined the Ottoman service, became Muslim, as a grandfather of Nazım Hikmet poet is an example. So we always suppress and erase the memory of Hungarians and Poles who allied with the Ottomans, or Ottomans trying to protect them against the Russians and Germans, but only remember this war as a clash of civilization. And then in my book, I also noted how late 19th century, early 20th century Indian, Muslim, and Hindu admirers of the Ottoman Empire actually emphasized one fact over and over again. That fact was that Ottoman Empire was giving non-Muslims higher level ministerial and ambassador positions. In fact, there is a list of ambassadors and ministers of Greek, Armenian, and Jewish background that these books mention. I don't know who gave them that. This was a very good list, actually. And our colleagues write a book on this, thing that there were 2,700 high-level positions given to the Christians in the Ottoman Empire. So when Indian Muslims or Indian Hindus too, when they admire the Ottomans as a good empire, they admired the caliphate as a civilized empire that gave rights to non-Muslims. It's the opposite of what we think of caliphate with Iraq, the last fundamentalist caliphate oppressing minority rights. So we can see how in early Pan-Islam, of we call the Aligarh Pan-Islam, this idea of religious tolerance, cosmopolitanism, inclusion, good governance was part of the reason why Pan-Islam, seen as a kind of a symbol of Muslim modernity, Muslim solidarity, without excluding Hindus and Christians in Ottoman Empire or in India. And I think that that is highly forgotten, because the story ends with partitions, both first in Turkey with Greeks and Turks, then in India with Pakistan and India, then Bangladesh comes in. And then in the middle, the third partition is the Arabs and the Jews. But in the first Pan-Islam, there is no partitions. People cannot predict these partitions will happen. So they still think very imperially in a very cosmopolitan terms. And so we should not be defeated by these, what I call Orientalist racist narratives of Battle of Vienna as a symptom of an eternal clash between Islam and Christianity. But that's a very good point. Thank you. And I think that same is true for seeing Aurangzeb or some event as a symptom of an eternal clash between Muslims and Hindus, which wasn't true.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask now another question which you have in detail discussed in your book. How Muslims had responded to the rise of the European colonialism and Ottoman European encounters in different geographies. And interestingly, I have found two responses in your book. The first response, somewhere you have mentioned as secular Muslims. Many of the Ottoman officials, Ottoman elites, they tried to invent a kind of response which was more, as you say, cosmopolitan, more accommodative, and by the idea of new Ottomanism or Ottoman Watan, maybe. But another response which we have also mentioned is you have also called it as puritanical. So in this response, you have mentioned the movement of Shah Waliullah Muhaddis Dehelvi, and also the Nigerian revivalist and the Abdul Wahab of Saudi Arabia. And interestingly, you have mentioned that these three revivalist projects were not successful, were not very influential, and they were not that much popular as we imagined at that time. So how do you see these two different Muslim responses to this period?
Yeah, this is a very important point. Also, a point of misperception, because late Cold War Islamism sees Wahhabis and these revolts as their predecessor, saying that, look, Muslims are always fighting. In reality, there was no one single response. It depends on the location, the conditions. But of course, there's one thing you can always expect is that nobody would like to be inferior. Nobody would like to be oppressed. Nobody would like to be mistreated. So Muslims will always want their rights, right? This is a human nature that you don't want to be discriminated, humiliated. But your strategy against injustices will be very different. In some locations, like let's say in India, what Sayyid Ahmed Khan was trying to do is to say that I'm going to improve the conditions of the Muslims in India. And then we will try to tame and reform the British Empire to make it like the Mughal Empire, make it more inclusive, giving our rights. And if that reformed British Empire would have worked, Hindus and Muslims would have been the majority. So you could have imagined that there would be Hindu and Muslim ministers in the government in London. I think that was they were imagining. But once metropolitan white population says, no, I don't want an empire of equality, then it's the white Europeans who betrayed the British Empire from that perspective, right? If you think of an inclusive empire, in some sense, Indians were more loyal to it. They thought, let's make it real good empire in some ways. And you have to kind of reverse that category. In terms of the Muslim response to that 19th century European colonialism, what the first Egyptian Muhammad Ali and then the Ottomans did is that because of their power and positions, they actually created this accommodationist response, saying that I could also be an empire, I could self-strengthen, and we could get along. I think there is a sense that these powers like the Ottomans, they actually don't want wars. And it's because they are a medium power, so the wars are not working for Ottoman advantage. They want to strengthen international law. So one aspect, if you're watching Abdulhamid show, Payitaht Abdulhamid in India, they show Abdulhamid as this kind of a Muslim Che Guevara living in a palace, always anti-imperialist. But obviously Abdulhamid wanted to, his job description is to strengthen the Ottoman Empire. But one thing that that movie doesn't show is that Abdulhamid's foreign ministry is really focused on strengthening international law. Because what he thinks, like China and Japan, is that you can defend the Ottoman Empire's rights through international law. So this is the kind of complex humanist internationalist response of Muslims, Hindus, Chinese in the 19th century that we don't read in white histories and Orientalist histories. Orientalist histories always says, we went there, they were fanatically rejecting us, we taught them some civilization, at the end they kicked us out, but we taught them nationalism, so how great we are. It's a very narcissistic narrative. But in reality, during the age of imperialism, actually it was the non-Europeans, the Indians, the Chinese, the Japanese, and the Ottomans, who formulated a universal alternative, saying that, look, stop your racism, let's agree on a good international law. Or stop your racism, let's agree on a good empire, right? These are visions of values and norms that people should agree with. And we also know, African and Asian countries also imagine a better international order. So if you're studying IR theory, we have to imagine that, before and after Bandung, it was the non-Europeans who wanted to make the international order a fair order, the UN without Security Council, or some sort of mechanism that respects sovereignty. So in that sense, we have a lot of work to do to kind of decolonize our notions of this, both Muslim intellectual history, Muslim history, as well as global political history. I hope that some of these points come out in the book, even though I centered the book as a critique of this stereotype idea of an Islamic world, which I was disturbed by. But the goal is to actually show what is good in that idea. So I don't mean to say the Islamic world did something for Sayyid Ahmed Khan or Shibli Nomani. They were looking for solidarity, or Malcolm X. They believed in this kind of global third world Muslim, Hindu, African solidarity and Islamic solidarity. But that wasn't just an automatic religious reaction to Christianity. I think that's a misconception that I was trying to shatter.
Is it this period when the idea of Madaniyat, which you have mentioned, has come?
Civilization, yes. I think that is a big silent revolution, how Muslims as well as other Asians reformulated the idea of civilization in an inclusive way. Because the story that we know from a famous answer of Mahatma Gandhi to a Western journalist, say, Mahatma, what do you think about Western civilization? And he said, it would be a good idea. He meant if you civilize the white Westerners, it would be a good idea. The civilization was used by Europeans as a sign of their superiority. And I think this is something about racism towards Muslims, Hindus, and Chinese. It was a little bit different than racism towards Africans. It was not based on a skin color. Racism was based on an idea of a civilizational superiority with a very complex sub-arguments, because Muslims, Chinese, and Indians have civilizations in the past. So then they have to say that your civilization in the past was great, but you declined, you degenerated, now you need European civilization to awaken you. You need to adjust. In that context, Muslim reformists wanted to rely on Ibn Khaldun's idea of civilization, but it seemed that that idea was found insufficient in the new context. There is a time during the Greek revolt, for example, some of the Ottoman officials used the Khaldunian idea of civilization, where civilized people are degenerate and weak, barbaric people are uh, militaristic and aggressive and strong. So they thought that Greek revolt became successful because they were Badawi, they were barbaric, they were carrying weapons, and Ottomans lost against Greeks because they became too civilized, they're not carrying weapons, they're too sophisticated. But that idea was being kind of abandoned in conversation with the Europeans. So by 1840s, Ottoman elites already appropriate and redesign this European idea of civilization in a linear history where humanity moves from lower level of civilization to advanced level. And but they think that in every age, one population becomes ahead of others in civilization. So it was the Indians, Egyptians, Arabs, and Muslims, and then Europeans. They have this kind of very interesting long wave of history. But that civilization, the idea of civilization in the Ottomans and then later other Muslims actually show how late 19th, early 20th century Muslim thought is very modernist. That we don't actually have, so quote unquote, we never had fundamentalists. We don't have fundamentalists in late 19th, early 20th century. We don't have Islamists. Ottoman Caliph was not Islamist. He wasn't trying to, I mean, Caliphate, even Caliphate itself was more or less a very civilized, cosmopolitan, and secular institution. Ottoman Caliphs wanted to create laws that treat non-Muslims equally. They abolished jizya. They abolished all discriminations to non-Muslim populations, right? And they did that in the name of an Islamic modernism, an idea of a civilized governance among Islam. So civilization became a very crucial part of apologetic Muslim modernity, but also a tool of resistance to European racism, to the extent that I think by 1920s and 30s, I will say, after Tagore, the idea of civilization now became a tool of anti-colonial nationalism. That then the Europeans dropped it too. They couldn't use it anymore after 1940s.
I will just ask one last question, and then I will ask my friends to, I will take their questions. The last question which I want to ask, and it is about, in the Muslim response, you have said that somehow that pan-Islamism was also a secular idea, and you have given the reference of two Ottoman intellectuals, Hilmi and Nouri, and one Indian Muslim scholar, Barkatullah, and you have mentioned that their ideas of pan-Islamism were very much secular, and they were very much critical of the Hamidian pan-Islamism, perhaps.
Yes, I mean that's a very good point to not confuse the pan-Islamism in the golden age of Indian Ottoman cooperation and exchanges in the age of Aligarh and Shibli Numani from the pan-Islamism of after Iranian Revolution. That early pan-Islamism is inclusive because Muslimness is racialized. It includes all the minorities. Like if you pay attention, some of the most famous pan-Islamists are not Sunni. Jamaluddin Afghani was originally Shiite. I mean, it didn't matter for him. But Sayyid Emir Ali is not Sunni. Aga Khan, I mean, Aga Khan and Sayyid Emir Ali wrote letter to Ankara government asking them to keep the caliphate and not abolish it. But people should have to indicate the irony of Aga Khan himself, who's not supposed to believe in a caliphate. I mean, he's the imam of the Ismaili community. Similarly, Shekib Arslan comes from a Druze family. In fact, he is the father-in-law of the current leaders of the Druze community in Lebanon. And nobody made a big deal out of these things, and it was people were very comfortable with that. And Barakatullah is a good example. Barakatullah's book on caliphate he wrote after Turkish government abolished the caliphate, and he says, caliphate can be democratic. Abdulhamid wasted caliphate's potential by abolishing the parliament. And he still defends Ankara government. He says that maybe the Turkish parliament, because Islam is very democratic, Turkish parliament should assume the role of the caliphate. They are lamenting it, because caliphate was spiritual in that sense. Even if you pay attention to the marriage politics after the end of caliphate, there were always Muslim monarchs like Nizam of Hyderabad, Egyptian Khedive, the king of Iraq. They wanted to marry the daughter of the last caliphs, last Ottoman Sultan, but we don't have a reverse. We don't have someone saying that, oh, I'm going to marry my daughter to your son. I guess, that never worked that way. So you can even see the kind of feminized spiritual interpretation of that caliphate even after the caliphate ended. So yeah, Pan-Islamism was a cosmopolitan universalist project, which was about international order, international law, globalist, anti-racist, and very similar to Pan-Africanist and Pan-Asianists. And that's why they could also make some sort of alliances with each other. And that's, I think, is the main argument of the first half of my book. That I hope that came out clearly. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor, for this wonderful and fascinating discussion. And I must say that your book, in initial 2017 and 18, it could not get that much popularity because of it arrived in the market lately there. But now it is gaining so much references all over the academic centers, and your discussions are becoming more and more popular there, and people really want to hear from you more and more. So I wish we have another opportunity to interact with you, and most likely, most possibly, in physical sense also, we have your visit there. So
well,
I would
inshallah,
like.
that would be my honor. I've been to India once, but I didn't have a chance to come to Aligarh. So I'm putting this in my list of to do after COVID quarantine, inshallah.
Once again, thank you very much.
My salams
And
to everyone, and I hope to see you in person. Thank you.
yes, assalamu alaikum.